September 2nd, 1945. The USS Missouri rode at anchor in Tokyo Bay beneath a sky that had cleared overnight into the kind of hard, bright Pacific blue that offers no ambiguity. A sky that seemed, to the men assembling on the battleship's deck that morning, to have decided that the occasion required clarity rather than drama. The bay was full of Allied warships, hundreds of them, arranged with the deliberate symbolism of a naval power that wanted the geometry of the moment to be legible from any angle. The Missouri herself had been positioned so that the flag flying from her mast was the same flag that had flown over the Capitol in Washington on December 7th, 1941, and the flag that Commodore Matthew Perry had carried into Japanese waters in 1853 when he had arrived with his black ships and his demand that Japan open itself to the world. The symbolism was not accidental. Nothing about the morning of September 2nd, 1945 was accidental. Every element of what was about to occur had been planned with the precision of a man who understood that history was watching and who intended to give history something worth watching. General of the Army Douglas MacArthur had spent 3 days thinking about what he would do when the Japanese delegation arrived. He had thought about it the way a theater director thinks about a production whose text is fixed, but whose staging determines whether the text becomes merely words or something that the audience carries out of the hall and into the rest of their lives. The text was the instrument of surrender, a document of 9 paragraphs whose legal and diplomatic content had been negotiated through the preceding weeks by men whose names history would largely forget. The staging was MacArthur's, and the staging problem he faced was one of the most delicate in the history of military ceremony. How to conduct the formal capitulation of an empire whose military culture had organized itself for centuries around the concept of honor, around the elaborate codified, institutionally enforced system of obligation and dignity that governed how Japanese officers presented themselves in every context of their professional lives, including and perhaps especially the context of defeat, in a manner that accomplished the complete and unambiguous assertion of American victory, without producing the kind of humiliation that Japanese military culture would transform into a grievance capable of outlasting the occupation. MacArthur had watched, with the analytical attention of a man who had been studying Japanese military culture since his first Pacific posting decades earlier, how the Japanese delegation had been received in the preliminary negotiations. He had noted the particular rigidity with which the Japanese officers carried themselves, the contained, almost architectural posture of men who had decided, before boarding the ship, that they would surrender their nation's sovereignty without surrendering the personal dignity that their culture had told them was the one thing that remained theirs regardless of outcome. They had been trained in an institution that taught its officers that how a man carried himself in the moment of defeat was the final and most demanding test of his character. That the warrior's worth was measured not in victory, which any competent soldier might achieve under favorable conditions, but in the quality of his bearing when the conditions had been entirely unfavorable and the outcome was no longer in doubt. These men had internalized that teaching with the completeness of people for whom it was not merely professional doctrine, but the organizing principle of a lifetime of self-construction. They would not bow, not to MacArthur, not to the assembled representatives of the Allied powers, not to the cameras that would carry the images of this morning to every nation on earth. The bow, in Japanese military culture, the formal acknowledgment of another's superior status, was something they had determined, in the private deliberation of the preceding days, they would withhold. If you're watching this for the first time, subscribe and hit the bell. These are the stories that history almost forgot, and we find them every single week. MacArthur knew they would not bow. He had been told as much through the diplomatic channels that had preceded the ceremony, and he had confirmed it through his own observation of the delegation's bearing in every interaction preceding the formal proceedings. The question was not whether the Japanese officers would bow. The question was what MacArthur would do about the fact that they would not, and what that decision would communicate to the Japanese delegation, to the assembled Allied officers, to the watching world, and to the historians who would eventually determine what the morning of September 2nd, 1945, had meant. The decision he made was one that surprised almost everyone who witnessed it, and that the Japanese officers who had prepared themselves for confrontation found more disorienting than any confrontation could have been. MacArthur did nothing. He acknowledged the refusal to bow, not with anger, not with the demand for compliance that the military hierarchy of the moment would have fully supported, not with the assertion of American authority over the forms of Japanese behavior that the occasion seemed to invite. He acknowledged it with a composure so complete and so apparently effortless that it communicated something the bow itself, had it been given, could never have communicated. It communicated that the bow did not matter, that the man standing at the table had no need of it, that his authority over this morning and over the terms that this morning was ratifying did not depend on the physical gestures of the men across from him, that he was sufficiently certain of what had been accomplished and what it meant that the withholding of a traditional courtesy registered to him as precisely nothing. To understand the full weight of this response, one must understand Douglas MacArthur, not the mythological MacArthur of popular memory, the operatic, self-dramatizing commander whose relationship with his own legend had complicated his relationships with almost every superior officer he had ever served under, but the MacArthur of September 1945, who was 75 days past his 65th birthday and who stood on the deck of the Missouri having survived the loss of the Philippines, the grinding campaign up the Pacific coast of New Guinea, the return to the Philippines he had promised, and 4 years of a war whose conduct had tested every quality he possessed and several he had been required to develop under pressure. This MacArthur had been humiliated in the early months of the war, had fled Corregidor under orders that he had internalized as a wound to the professional identity he had spent a lifetime constructing. He had rebuilt from that wound through the subsequent years with the particular determination of a man who understood that rebuilding was the only available response and who had made the quality of the rebuilding a demonstration that the wound had not been fatal to what he fundamentally was. The man who stood at the surrender table on September 2nd was not performing composure. He had earned it through the years and the decisions and the costs of the Pacific campaign, through the specific and personal knowledge of what defeat felt like and what the reconstruction from defeat required, through the understanding that authority rooted in demonstrated competence across 4 years of the most demanding kind of warfare does not require the validation of a bow from the men it has defeated. MacArthur's composure in the face of the Japanese officer's refusal was not magnanimity in the conventional sense, not the generous condescension of a victor who can afford to overlook the gestures of the vanquished. It was something more precise and more interesting than that. It was the composure of a man who understood the Japanese officer's choice, who understood, with the cultural literacy of decades of study and engagement, exactly what the refusal to bow meant in the framework that had produced it, and who had decided that the most powerful response available to him was to demonstrate that the framework itself was no longer operative. The Japanese officers who had refused to bow had done so within a framework that assigned the bow its significance, a framework in which the gesture of formal acknowledgment to a superior was charged with the full weight of the honor culture that had organized Japanese military life for generations. In that framework, the refusal to bow was an assertion of retained dignity, a statement that defeat had not dissolved the self that defeat had been inflicted upon, a preservation of the one thing that the officers believed remained within their control. MacArthur's indifference to the refusal dissolved the framework rather than challenging it. It communicated that the framework in which the bow carried its significance, the framework of imperial military culture, of the honor codes and the hierarchies and the elaborately managed performances of dignity that had organized Japanese military life, was no longer the operative framework of this moment. The operative framework was MacArthur's. And in MacArthur's framework, the bow was simply not an important element of what was happening. The ceremony that followed was conducted with a spare, deliberate formality that MacArthur had designed to communicate precisely this, that what was occurring was not a ritual of humiliation, but a legal and historical event whose significance transcended the emotional registers that humiliation would have activated. MacArthur spoke for less than 5 minutes. His address, which he had written himself and which he delivered without notes, was not a speech of triumph. It was a speech of conclusion, of a man noting with the controlled precision of someone who had been waiting a long time for this moment and had decided that the waiting itself had taught him something about how the moment should be handled, that a great tragedy had ended and a great victory had been won, and that the occasion called not for celebration, but for the kind of sober clarity that the scale of what had been paid for the victory demanded. He spoke of the hope that a better world would emerge from the wreckage of the old one. He spoke of the dead of both sides. He spoke of the responsibility that fell on the victorious as surely as on the defeated to ensure that what had been purchased at such cost would be honored in the peace that followed. The Japanese delegation signed. General Yashijiro Yumizu, representing the Imperial General Staff, approached the table with the bearing of a man walking to his own execution and conducting himself in a manner that his honor demanded be indistinguishable from how he would have walked into any room under any circumstances. He signed. Mamoru Shimizu, the foreign minister, who had lost a leg to an assassin's bomb years earlier and who climbed the Missouri's gangway on a prosthetic with the particular visible effort of man for whom every public act of physical difficulty was also an act of public dignity, signed. The other members of the delegation signed, and none of them bowed. And MacArthur, watching them sign with the same composed attention he had maintained throughout the morning, gave no indication that he had noticed the absence of what he had not expected and had not required. The Allied commanders signed in order of precedence: American, British, Australian, Canadian, French, Dutch, New Zealand, Soviet, Chinese, a sequence that itself communicated the coalition's composition and its hierarchy with the precision of a document written not only in words, but in the order of names on a page. MacArthur signed with 6 pens, distributing them afterward to figures whose symbolic importance he had calculated with the theatrical precision he brought to all such decisions. One to General Jonathan Wainwright, who had surrendered Corregidor and spent the intervening years in Japanese captivity, flown to Tokyo specifically for this morning. One to General Arthur Percival, who had surrendered Singapore. The choice of these 2 men, of the defeated commanders whose defeat had defined the war's opening catastrophe for the Allied cause, was not sentimental. It was a statement about the arc of the war, about what defeat and survival and the long reconstruction from catastrophe had produced, about the fact that the men who had been present at the worst moments were present now at the conclusion, and that their presence connected the conclusion to everything that had preceded it and gave the conclusion its full weight. For the Japanese officers on the deck of the Missouri, the experience of the ceremony was documented in the memoirs and testimonies that several of them produced in the post-war years with a specificity that illuminates what the morning had meant from the other side of the table. What they had prepared themselves for in the days before September 2nd was the ceremony that Japanese military culture would have staged in the analogous position. A ceremony organized around the assertion of the victor's superiority and the formal acknowledgment of the defeated subordination, conducted in the explicit language of hierarchy and honor that both sides understood, and that gave the gestures of defeat their full, humiliating significance. What they encountered was something that the preparation had not anticipated. MacArthur's refusal to demand the bow, his apparent indifference to whether it was given, deprived them of the confrontation they had steeled themselves for, and left them in a space that their framework had not provided a response to. They had prepared for humiliation. They received formality. They had prepared to resist the demand for submission. The demand was never made, and the absence of the demand was, in its way, more disorienting than the demand would have been. General Yumizu, who had been among the most determined opponents of surrender within the Japanese high command and who had argued until the final hours for continued resistance, wrote in his post-war memoir that the ceremony on the Missouri had surprised him in a way that he had not expected to be capable of being surprised after the years of the war. What surprised him was not MacArthur's authority, which he had anticipated. It was MacArthur's restraint. The absence of the triumphalism that Yumizu's own military culture would have considered the victor's natural expression of his position. The composure that communicated, without stating, that the man who possessed genuine authority had no need to perform it in the register that the defeated expected. Ieyasu had prepared himself to endure the performance. The performance never came. And what came instead? The formal, spare, historically serious ceremony that MacArthur had designed and conducted required a response that Ieyasu's preparation had not equipped him to make, because the response it required was simply to receive it, without the resistance that anticipated humiliation had primed him to mount. The broader historical significance of MacArthur's decision on the morning of September 2nd extended beyond the ceremony itself into the occupation that followed. The occupation of Japan, which MacArthur would administer as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers through the subsequent years, faced a challenge of extraordinary complexity. The transformation of a militarized, emperor-worshipping, hierarchically organized society into something compatible with the peaceful international order that the wars victors were attempting to construct from the wreckage of the old one. The challenge was not primarily military. Japan's military had been destroyed. The challenge was political, social, and psychological. The challenge of working with a population that had been prepared by everything its institutions had taught it to resist the occupation as the final expression of the national will that defeat had not extinguished. The manner in which the surrender ceremony had been conducted, the restraint, the formality, the absence of the humiliation that Japanese military culture would have deployed in the analogous position, established a tone for the occupation that MacArthur maintained with considerable consistency through its subsequent years. The occupation was not gentle. It was not without its coercions and its impositions and its moments of the kind of casual contempt that occupying powers tend to exhibit toward occupied populations. But it was, at its institutional core, an occupation that treated the Japanese population as a people capable of the transformation being asked of it, rather than as a people to be punished for what its institutions had done. And the ceremony on the Missouri had established, in the most public and symbolic way available, that this was the register in which the occupation would operate. The chocolate bar that American servicemen distributed in the days following the surrender, handed to Japanese civilians with the casual generosity of men who had more than they needed and who had been raised in a culture that responded to that condition by sharing, carried its familiar argument about American abundance. The pen that MacArthur used to sign the instrument of surrender carried a different argument, one about the relationship between power and restraint, between authority and the need to perform it, between the victor's capacity for humiliation and the victor's choice not to exercise that capacity. Both arguments were made on the same morning, in the same bay, under the same hard Pacific sky. Both were understood by the Japanese who received them as statements about the civilization making them. And both would shape, in ways that the making of them did not fully anticipate, the relationship between two nations that had just finished trying to destroy each other and were now required to determine what came next. What came next was, by the historical measure of what tends to follow wars of the Pacific War's ferocity and duration, remarkable. Japan rebuilt. The occupation ended. The two nations became allies of a closeness and durability that the morning of September 2nd, 1945, would have seemed to make improbable. The reasons for this outcome were multiple and complex and the subject of decades of historical analysis. But among them, in the assessment of historians who have examined the occupation's foundations carefully, is the character of the surrender ceremony itself. The specific decision made by a 75 to past 65-year-old general to receive the Japanese officer's refusal to bow with the composure of a man who had no need of the bow, who understood what the refusal meant, and chose not to make it the occasion for the confrontation it was designed to provoke, who staged the ending of the Pacific War in the register of historical seriousness rather than of personal or national triumph. MacArthur was not, by any honest assessment, a modest man. The theatrical self-regard that characterized his public presence through the war and the occupation was real and was documented by everyone who observed it closely. But on the morning of September 2nd, 1945, he made a choice that was, in its consequences, the most modest thing he ever did. He chose not to demand what the moment would have supported demanding. He chose to conduct the ending of the greatest war in human history as a serious event rather than a triumphant one. And the Japanese officers who had refused to bow and who had prepared themselves for the confrontation that refusal was supposed to produce found. Instead, a man who had looked at their refusal and decided, with the composure of someone who understood what he was doing and why, that it was simply not important enough to address. The bow was never given. The occupation succeeded, and the hard Pacific blue of that September morning held both facts with the same clear, unambiguous light it had brought to everything else. The warships in the bay, the flag on the mast, the table on the deck, the pens, the document, the men on both sides of it, and the silence that followed the signing, which was the silence of something enormous having ended and something new, uncertain and unmapped, having begun. Freedom does not always look like freedom in the moment of its establishment. Sometimes it looks like a general at a table choosing not to demand a gesture from the men across from him. Sometimes it looks like restraint, like the decision to conduct power without performing it, to assert authority without requiring its theatrical confirmation, to end a war in the register of history rather than a victory. The Japanese officers who walked off the Missouri that morning had not bowed. They had also not been humiliated. And the distinction between those two facts, the space between the gesture that was withheld and the humiliation that did not follow, was the space in which the possibility of what came next was quietly, without announcement, established. MacArthur understood that space. He had created it deliberately, and in creating it, he had done something that no weapon and no battle and no strategic campaign had been able to do in 4 years of the most destructive war in human history. He had given the defeated a way forward that did not require them to deny what they had been, while making clear, with the composure of a man who had earned the right to that composure through everything the preceding years had demanded of him, what they would need to become. If this story stayed with you, and we believe it did, leave a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe if you have not already. The moments that shaped the peace matter as much as the moments that shaped the war. We will keep finding them both.